the industry standards as well as anything else. But let me just drive right in. Like the title of this has really been something about freedom within a framework, and there are standard ways of doing things, but we really have to think what makes most sense for our own transformation, because as Gilles has mentioned, there's no sort of one perfect way to do all of this. Can you still see my screen? Okay, so what I was saying is that transformation is never clean, it's never pretty, it's always messy. Major transformation, it's too hard to pre-specify everything that's going to happen or everything you're going to come up with. And the other message behind what we're going to talk about today is that there is no one way to do it which is right for everybody. However, having said that, you do need some sort of structure to sort of depend upon to help you get organized, even if your way of doing it is going to be different than everybody else's. And I'm going to take you through a few examples of Canadian organizations, some private sector, some public sector, and some of the approaches they have taken towards this transformation. But we're doing things, as Gilles mentioned this, is we're doing major things like IT system replacement. I'm seeing a lot of this happening these days where people's software is going out of support. The functionality doesn't support the business the way it is today. And major new, and this has been going on for a long time, of course, major new things like ERP or CRM or manufacturing resource planning, things like that are being brought in. But when it's just a technology replacement, there's a huge opportunity missed to really modernize and bring the business up to date. Major transformation of the whole business, new product, new services, new markets. And something we're seeing is on an acquisition, where you integrate different companies together, there's a lot of transformation work, at least for one of the two, maybe for both companies. New business model, new ways of operation, people trying to become an agile business, not just agile software, but an agile business. Digital is driving a lot of this. And we're even seeing a lot of organizations realize that their data quality is just an absolute problem. And so getting things realigned and so on. New ideas, focusing on business performance, and programs to move from operational excellence to much more to a relationship-based or customer experience-based, and innovation. So there's so many different things that could go on this list. But one of the things that happens with all of them is just a bit to the right, is there's a lot of things in play. So this is a hexagon I developed a number of years ago that says basically we need to improve performance. But in order to do that, we need processes to work properly. We need access to the right information, which we can trust. We have to make sure that we understand and have a good strategy. But then maybe our rules, our policies need to change. Maybe our organizational structure needs to change. Maybe our people's skills and competencies need to change. We certainly see a lot of technology coming into it, or even things like facilities and locations might change. And of course, culture is a big issue. So all transformations at some point must address the things in the hexagon. But in some cases, certain aspects of what's in the hexagon are there's more opportunity for improvement in some than others. So how do I allocate my scarce resources to the best things that I need to change? I think this is a fundamental question in all transformation, is how do I basically use executive time and corporate money as well as the frontline resources? How do I put them on the right things that will make the biggest difference, as opposed to just having a lot of hard effort that won't make much difference? So lots of choices. So when we're doing this, I think that really there's sort of 5 major pieces we have to think about. Is what is our strategy for transformation? Where are we aiming? What about the work? Some people like the word business process. Some people don't like the term so much, but we all do work. We change how we do our work. So the processes are important, especially when they deliver value to our outside customers and other stakeholders. What do we need to know? What business information is critical? And what do we have to build? What capabilities do we have to invest in order to be able to do the things we wish to do, which are supporting our strategy in the first place? And then how do we then monitor and continue to optimize on an ongoing basis? So these 5 things are things that we can think about. And the people I'm going to talk to you about today have all taken a sort of a different emphasis. And however, ultimately, they have to cover all of it, but their approach to it has been a bit different. And I think that's the message, is we need certain degree of confidence that the approach that we're going to talk about will work for us. And so what we do in Process Renewal Group is just take this to more to a common sense level, I hope, where we do 4 major things. We try to define the business. We will design the business, which is typically the structural aspects of a business architecture. We have to build the business, actually make the changes happen. And then, of course, we have to operate and execute the business in the right way. But these things are all touching each other. So at the beginning, I'm doing a lot of work around external environment, stakeholders, our business and operating models, and ultimately coming up with a set of strategic objectives and also strategic capabilities or requirements, understanding what we need to do, what we need to get in place, so that then we can go to the structural part and say, what information do we need to structure? What processes or value streams do we have to execute? What capabilities do I have to have in place and build in a smart way? And how will I measure the business? So this is very much the structure of how we do things. And the important thing to note here too is that this little circle goes around all of these. We cannot get perfect information in the model before we look at process, before we look at capabilities. We're looking at all of them and learning from all of them as we're going. And when we get to building the business, we have to prioritize, plan our resources, put our change roadmaps in place, and actually do the hard work of making changes happen in all the things in the hexagon. And after that, of course, we can continue to measure, manage what we put in place end to end, and be able to do continuous improvement, or come back to the beginning and rethink the business again. So it's just a framework to look at. It's not a methodology. It's just a series of things to keep in mind as we're going. So I'm going to basically look at some examples based upon this. This is the first example. This is the Ministry of Justice in a Canadian province. And really what they wanted to do is get better citizen service in justice, and also to be more cost effective with the resources that we have. So the issue in this province was that there were so many civil cases clogging up the court system that people were not getting heard, were not getting their cases reviewed in nearly the right amount of time. And in some cases, because of the delays, the cases had to be basically forgiven. So the courts were backlogged, trivial issues. The other thing they also said, and this is not my view necessarily, but that they said is, we have too many lawyers. There are too many lawyers involved in civil disputes as opposed to criminal disputes. Cases are more and more civil disputes with lots of condos being built in this province. And so people are closer together and they fight each other over crazy things. Also, they found that it was very manual processes they were dealing with, and so they wanted to digitalize. And they were going to update the legislation anyway, so they thought, well, can we rethink how we do all of this? And can we sort of then make sure we build the legislation to support what we're doing? So their approach was very much like this. And I'll give you different approaches for the 3 other ones I'm going to talk about. They started with very, very strong stakeholder analysis. Who are the external parties they had to interact with? And how would those parties interact with one another? They then decided to take a process-based approach, a process architecture approach, and they built their North Star, which is that sort of common agreement on where we needed to end up and be successful. And they did that for the major processes they were putting in place. They then focused strongly on data. And then what they did is they went very heavily into a prototyping mode, sort of like an agile style, but prototyping without doing all the software work, mocking it up, and then going into an agile development and learning and trying and working with all kinds of other organizations in the same government. From there, they developed an IT infrastructure, a product-based approach infrastructure. They defined those requirements, built the IT, and then they went into the marketplace to change everybody in the province to get used to a whole new way of doing things. Now, what that looked like was this, and I think you can see here is given away at the bottom. This is British Columbia. There's something called BC Civil Resolution Tribunal. And historically, the government would provide an adjudication service. That means go to court with your problems. And that's where things were clogging up. So what they said is, well, can we do things earlier, change the business model? And so when they went earlier, they said, well, we can put adjudicators and facilitation in place where we could do this online. We do not have to be real time. You do not have to all drive to the same place and sit and have a hearing. So this can be asynchronous. It can be done through video meetings, emails, as well as having the sort of the classics send in your documents. So this is a facilitation service with a facilitator who would actually get you through the problem. So like an arbitration. They said, well, hang on, can we even avoid that? And this is really where the big part of the change came. They put in place a completely digital party to party. So somebody has a dispute and somebody has to respond to that dispute. So if somebody drives across your front garden when they're drunk one night and destroys your fence and your flowers, if that's your neighbor, you can have a claim with your neighbor. But what you can do is you can go online, state your claim, put in your case, name the respondent, and the respondent has to reply by law now, because they changed the legislation. They have to reply to that in a digital fashion. So this digital front-end solution, the whole point was to avoid having to go further, to show to the parties that they can resolve this themselves with this expert system, with artificial intelligence support on what is the best way to go here. Now, the organization is not allowed to give advice because you have to sort it out yourself. But they would do things like say, well, for this type of claim that you're putting in, the data says 3% of these cases are successful. Would you like to go ahead? And so they basically feed the data, feed the reality to people, so that this becomes a peer-to-peer resolution. If that doesn't get resolved, it can go to an arbitration. If that doesn't get resolved, it can go to court. And even after court, they put in place, like a lot of problems that come in are because people didn't live up to their obligation, didn't pay the money, didn't pay the fines. So this is a reminder. So what they did is they took the whole life cycle of a claim, which could be civil dispute, and they put it through this process. And it's to the point now where even if you want to go to court, you must start here. You must start here, and you must put your evidence in here. And one of the reasons this works is that any evidence which is put in place here can be used in court. So these are legal documents you're now filing. And so as a result of this, they have significantly reduced the number of civil cases going into the court system and through with a judge and lawyers. It's revolutionary. They're the only people in the world doing it. Now they're selling the service to other organizations in other places in the world. Major transformation. But to do that, what they really focused on is three major things at the beginning. One was, what type of information has to be exchanged between stakeholders and with the Justice Department ministry. So lots of information being exchanged, documents, claims, and things like that. They also focused very much on where the benefit would be. Where's the benefit for the person who's making the claim? Well, there's speed, and there's much more likelihood that this would be resolved in a faster way. The other thing, of course, is the longer a claim goes on, the more expensive it becomes. And so to basically have benefits. So there's the items we exchange, there's the benefits, but also there's the experience. The experience of going through this traditionally is not very pleasant. But with the digital approach they put in place now, much earlier, it's a much more straightforward experience. And so one of the things they really did is they focus on two things. They focus on the process of doing the work. Here, this is like the third item in the list I showed you. But also the stakeholder, the initiator and the respondent, and all the data that has to come through from the initiator through the process out to the other side again, with a definition of all the guidelines and policies and a definition of all the enabling capabilities that are required to do it. This was the main mechanism they used to sort all of it out, and then they can go into prototyping and agile development mode. This is now operational. If you want to go to bcresolutiontribunal.com or look that up, you'll find it. You will be able to actually file a claim if you want to right now. It will cost you $6, not too bad. Okay, so that's one organization. Another organization, this is a leading food and snack company. They're a global company, but in Canada, their Canadian operations, they're real leaders. This is what corporate office told them. Said, okay, we want you over the next 5 years, we want you to grow your revenue by 15% per year for 5 years, compounded. Now, that sounds like a really aggressive target, and it is. It's even more aggressive when you realize the categories of product that they sell are naturally growing at 2% per year. So you have to significantly outgrow the marketplace and do it every year for 5 years. And of course, while you're doing that, we want you to retain your return on assets, return on total assets. And by the way, grow cash while you're doing it. This is virtually an impossible task that they were given. So one of the things they realized is that they couldn't just make nicer packaging and do a better job of manufacturing. They're already world class in that area. So they had to change their value proposition, their whole strategy, from operational excellence to consumer intimacy. Whereas in the past, they just sell things to people like Loblaw and Sobeys and Metro and people like that. They sell their products through a channel. Now they're reaching out much more directly to the marketplace itself, so customer intimacy. And by the way, while they were doing this, they also had to replace their SAP at the same time. Now, I'm happy to say that they were successful. So at the end of that 5-year period, they had doubled their business, and they were profitable and successful. But one of the things they did is they changed their strategy and said, we have to acquire competitors, otherwise we'll never get the market share that we need. And so they acquired competitors, integrated them into their companies, which is another whole initiative, got them all onto the same version of SAP at the same time, and it worked like a charm. Their SAP implementation worked in the first hour of operations. They were shipping products out the door successfully with no technical product. And it's because they did some of the key work we're going to talk about here. They went back and said, how do I reformulate my strategy? They really focused on a completely different view of what their processes should be. They then looked at how would we design the organization, and then from there they basically combined the process and the organization and said, how do I realign my standard operating procedures so I can get people working at it right away? From all of this, they re-looked at the IT requirements and then made a major push into the marketplace and worked with their customers in a completely different way. To sustain all this, they had a quality program before, but they really pushed on the quality program so they could sustain the benefits. And then they focused very much on culture change. So this is just the general logic. A lot of these things are definitely overlapped as they're going forward. And this is something they ended up with regard to their models. So one of the things they had to do is they had to really socialize this with the business. And so what they found is that they really have they're sort of operate the business, where they said we make, we plan demand, we plan supply, we store, move, co-pack, produce things, and we then sell. Then we have, because working through channels like Walmart, Costco, and so on, the other ones I mentioned, basically dealing with all the things that happen in here. And then they listen to the marketplace. This is really the new thing, really focus a lot more on the marketplace. What was the portfolio? What kind of communications needed to be in place? So this is sort of the core business. But this is a very complex organization. This is operate the business in Canada. They have enabling services and processes in Canada, like IT and HR and things like that. They have corporate guidance. So they have a Canadian guidance with sales and operational planning, but they also had corporate guidance. And down under here, they had the enabling services in Canada, but they also had corporate enabling services. Their enabling services group that does HR and IT and everything like that has 7,000 people in it serving the whole world. So it's even though Canada was one operation, it had to fit into everything else that was taking place as well. So they really focused on having a very simple view of what this looks like with a very complex set of workflows and information flows sitting underneath all of this. That's where they started it. That was their approach. But another one, this is a regulatory organization. They're an industry regulatory body, and what they do is they regulate technical products. So if your organization is putting in place a manufacturing facility, they're going to be there looking at the electrical. They're going to be looking at the gas. They're going to be looking at boilers. If you have a multi-story building, you have elevators. They're going to be looking at those types of things. So they basically establish the standards, but they also monitor and certify and permit. So their initial driver was that the software is going out of support. But at the same time, they knew that with all these different things like electrical versus elevators, each one of those in the organization was almost its own little business. And so, but however, people still have to certify, they still have to get licenses, and they still have to get permits. But that's true across all these different technologies. So what they wanted to do is have one way of doing things across technology. So it's a fundamental change in how the business is going to operate, a fundamental change in how people are going to do things, because each of these technologies had grown up doing it their own way. So these 7 areas of regulation glued on top, as opposed to being integrated as they came in. So basically, they have an overwhelming number of cases which they consider to be exceptions, but they weren't exceptions, they were just different cases. And also, this is very, very important. They had a strategic desire to become partners with the industry and not an enemy of the industry, because otherwise, lots and lots of work was going underground and was not being inspected and therefore was not safe. So major, major transformational change. So what they did is they said, let's start with the context of the world we're in. Let's look at our business concepts, which are very much the information view. Then they focused on the architecture and got heavily into process design thinking, which is very much the customer-oriented thinking. Then they looked at all the capabilities, say, can we rationalize these capabilities across seven technologies, look at the IT requirements, and then acquire IT, and then do the cultural realignment. So their approach was a slightly different approach. And so this safety regulator, in terms of context, it was just this simple diagram here, which is like, I'm the regulator, and these are all the licensees and basically qualified professionals. What information do I exchange with the outside world? And because at the other end of each one of these lines, something comes in, it's going to hit some end-to-end process inside that has to work. But prior to that, they really focused on this issue. As you see in here, I have homeowners, I have contractors, I have permits, but you can't get a permit if you don't have a license to operate, and you can only have certified professionals working in conjunction with the limitations of the permit and so on. So these are just the big information buckets. We call them concepts or information concepts. Some people call them information objects. These are all the big buckets of information. And just how is everything going to work when we're done? What do we want this to be? So not only will this be really, really useful to define the business, it's also incredibly useful for moving towards proper data design afterwards. So they did that to get everybody on the same page. And then they also then said, okay, well, what are our value streams? And so what am I regulate, which is the core. I accredit individuals, I license contractors, I assure compliance to standards, I respond to incidents and disaster recoveries, I educate the world, and there's all kinds of other things, administrative processes, and there's also governance or strategic processes, like establishing strategic plans. It's also these are what we call the enabling processes, which are the resources that we get. I get people, technology, business processes, data, good quality data. And this is sort of all the things we need in order to run any business. So they started with all of these. And then what we did, because I worked on this, we then prioritized. We said, of all those processes, which ones on the right-hand side, do we have to be world-class? Which ones do we have to be good, but we don't have to be world-class? And it's not worth being different. We just need to be the same as everybody else. And which ones don't make much difference at all? So we affectionately call this pain and gain. The gain is strategic value. And the point here being that ultimately, they're going to be redeveloping their software stack. And one of the things that everybody agreed is any process here, process 3, 4, 1, 10, we should not customize our ERP to do this. Why? Because it doesn't make any difference if we do. We don't need to be better. We need to just take what's out of the box if we can. Whereas 9 and 7 and 5, we need to do special things. We need to be unique in those areas. So triaging this is really quite an important issue. Now we can also triage another aspect. So this is to the right is strategic importance, to the top is how badly broken is it compared to what you need. So this says to me, number 9 is really important, the most important things we have, but it's also not working well compared to where we need it to be. That's where I put my money. Even though 8 is not perfect, and maybe it could be better, if I put all my money into 8, I do not get any strategic lift. I do not realize my strategy much at all. This could be things like, I'm going to do a better job of watering the flowers in the office, whereas this is core things for customers. So this was the critical issue, because it allowed them to put in place a program of change which is 4 years long as they roll out the new technology. They're rolling out the stuff that makes a difference earlier than anything else, and they know exactly what they need to do because they know each one of those processes has been designed now. Okay, I'll get you through this quickly, and then we can talk about it. This is a Canadian vehicle and equipment marketplace intermediate. In other words, they run marketplaces for auctions, auctioning out big tractors and other really heavy equipment, and they bring together buyers and sellers of those equipment. But along the way, so traditionally they've done on-site auctions. They've acquired several digital companies with their own marketplaces, and they're having a really difficult time bringing them together. So basically, and then in the middle of all this, COVID hit, which means the on-site auctions basically disappeared, trying to do an on-site auction remotely. And while all that's happening, new CEO, a complete reorganization, which wasn't the best, wasn't done very well, and they changed the focus to products like inspections and repairs and painting of vehicles, but they really didn't have the whole thing connected from end to end. And on top of that, they wanted to go to microservices in IT. so that we didn't have to have big applications and so on. A lot of change all at the same time under a lot of pressure. So they started with an IT application architecture, which may not have been my first choice, but they started by saying, well, what are all these IT applications? Because we just got to fix something now. Then they stepped back and said, well, while we're doing that and getting ready for the future, let's define our business concepts, the information view. Let's look at our business capabilities, because we're going to have to build microservices, and then looking at the process architecture. But in reality, what actually happened here is these three, concept, capability, and processes, quickly became very iterative, because we found that we couldn't really design the capabilities if we didn't know where they're going to be used. And we really couldn't identify the capabilities and really didn't even know what kinds of information we were dealing with. These three got a bit closer, but they started in this sequence. Now they're basically revisiting their products and services, and selectively, according to prioritization, they're doing their IT microservices. And so that change program, for the couple that are coming out now, that change program is underway, and they know they're going to have to reorganize again. So they have to do something because it's urgent, but they're trying to build a better architecture out behind all of it. But this is what the point I was just making before. What they're finding is they have processes which are broken, which means they've got certain capabilities which aren't working very well. But if they fix this capability for this process, they realize that same capability is used in more than one process. So, for example, the customer contracting process, which right now has 54 different contract types. If I go build a new capability to deal with that, I've got a lot of other processes like settlement. When they settle, they need the contract. So if I fix it for contracting, I might mess it up for some other process. I've got to know how processes and capabilities work with each other and what information is impacted when I go to make these changes. So this is really, really important, we've discovered, for transformation, that if we change one thing, there's an impact on something else. So as transformation leaders, we really, really do have to have an identification of all the processes or value streams, all the capabilities that need to be built, which might show up as microservices in IT, but these are more business capabilities, and all the information that's affected, because I cannot touch one without impacting the others, and I better know what I'm doing before I go anywhere. So this knowledge of the impact of change is something that they're really wrestling with, because it's a very complex business. Okay, so this is, I think, the last one I'm going to talk to you about. This is, again, a public service agency with a drive to operational excellence. So now here's the issue. This is actually a transit corporation. And again, it's British Columbia. What they do is they operate all transit for the province. And so what they were finding was that they had not invested in any technology for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, a long, long time. That old technologies, but the world is changing. The ridership is growing, but really very, very slowly, much slower than what they needed to have it. And there's a very antagonistic relationship from the transit corporation, the municipalities where these buses run, and the bus operating companies who actually drive the buses and put on the drivers and keep everything working every single day. And this organization is very, very popular for the public to be complaining about it all the time. And the different political parties were kicking it around like a game of football. So they had to do something quite different than what they'd done before. So their role, and by the way, the transit doesn't work without the bus companies, without the municipalities, and without the transit corporation all working together, but that was not the case. So what we decided was we would pull all three parties into a transformation. I think this is a really critical point. We couldn't just transform the transit company, because I still had to work with the municipalities and the bus companies in order to make that work. And so you can imagine this to being quite political with the municipalities. And so what we decided to do is step back. And so basically they stepped back and said, who are all the stakeholders in the province who have some interest in what we're doing, including the writers and including the non-writers as well. So who are those stakeholders and what's really going on? What are the processes by which we do our work? How do we create value? And then we stepped into prioritization. Because this was so big, we had to sort of make a smaller set of things to focus on. And for the priority ones, build the capability design. From that, derive the IT requirements and look at the data. And from that, build a multi-year program of change. Now, when they started this, they basically had they were sort of tentatively given a budget of $40 million as an IT replacement. By the time they had finished, they realized they can get a lot more done with the right business case, which was for $25 million for business transformation. This is remarkable. Whereas before, they're focusing so much on replacing technology that they didn't think about the business. Now, in this particular case, this took a year and a quarter, which was a series of about 5 workshops spread out with 140 people in each workshop. So we had to, make sure that it was very, very well designed so we could actually facilitate those types of meetings. But every single sub-workshop had municipality people, bus operating people, and transit corporation people working together, along with other agencies and so on. So where they ended up was here. These, at the top, there are value streams and other processes, about 140 of them, I think it is, maybe even a bit more than that. Down here, there's a definition of all the capabilities that had to be developed in order to make this possible. And in here is the major subject areas of information that had to be tackled. So they said, and ideally, this is where we'll be. But today, this is where we are. We're red on most of it. So very, very bad situation. They said, well, what are we trying to do? In year 1, we will green up some of this. In year 2, we'll put some more. In year 3, some more. Year 4, some more. Year 5, this is where we're going. So they built their transformation plan out of a combination of improving how the work got done with the processes and value streams, making sure the right information had a good data quality in these areas, and which building blocks we put in place to be able to realize that benefit. So they use this to figure all that stuff out. So the point is, they all did it differently. Some started strongly on the left-hand side. Other ones started strongly on information. Other ones went to capabilities. Several went to processes. But in every single case, performance was an issue. And they all had some form, sometimes it was more structured, of prioritization before they jumped into the transformation, before they started rolling out the changes. So you have to sort of do what makes sense. And this is where this expression came from. We call it freedom within the framework. So true freedom is not the absence of structure, letting employees go off and do whatever they want, but rather it's a very clear structure, but it enables people to work within established boundaries in an autonomous and creative way. So I think it's one of my favorite quotes from people. 1935 was when this quote was made. And I think that this is something that we can all sort of think about. So I should show you this. Well, this is just an example of the Civil Resolution Tribunal right at the beginning. Example of a great success. This did not go to court. It went to arbitration. So the Strata rule says 1 small dog or cat is permitted, small being defined as an animal that can be comfortably picked up and carried, okay? And the finding was, applying the literal meaning of the words, there is evidence that the applicant can pick up and carry the dog. Comfort is very subjective, but there was no distress in the applicant or the dog. So this person won his case, but it never went to court, right? So that's an example of success. So Gilles, I'm gonna put it back to you now, and we'll see where we go. I've probably spoken a bit too long.
No, fine. I think people appreciate that. Okay. Let me switch here and take the screen on.
Yeah, I can take my screen off now, or I can stop sharing. Let's see here. You got your screen back on, or do I have? I swear. You have to take it back for me.
Okay. That's what I did. Montrer mon écran. Voilà.
Okay, you're good?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then let me switch here. I was gonna go at the end. So do people see my screen now?
Oh, lots of questions there.
Yeah, well, we're not. This is just to pour alimenter vos questions. Écoutez, ce que je vous suggère, c'est ceux qui veulent poser la main, poser une question, lever la main. Je vais vous donner, vous permettre de poser la question. Est-ce qu'il y a une des questions? Oui. Alors, tout était clair, tout était beau.
Allô Gilles, c'est Luc. Simplement vous dire que je dois quitter. J'ai une réunion de clients malheureusement à 13h. Merci beaucoup pour la belle présentation. Thank you, Roger, for the presentation. Unfortunately, I need to leave for a client meeting at 1 o'clock.
Good. Okay. For those of you who are still around, Roger, you talk about process. Why are process so important, and why don't we see more organizations paying attention to process?
Yeah, I think that I think it's actually critical, because everything that gets done means somebody did some work. Either a person did some work or a technology did some work. And traditionally, we have basically done that work by specializations or functional departments. But the interesting thing is the ultimate recipient of all of that, the customer or maybe some other person outside, in the outside world, doesn't care about our departments. They don't care about our functions. They only care about the results. So they care whether or not value was created for them. So if we want to align the work, we have to make sure we truly understand the outcomes. And so when we say process, when I say process, I think very much about from the outside world going back over all the work we do, going back to the outside world. So if somebody clicks on our website and says, I want to place this order, it doesn't matter what happens inside the box as far as the customer is concerned. But we have to make sure all the work we do is driven towards providing the result that that person expected when they clicked. And that has nothing to do with the organization chart as far as the customer is concerned. So if we really want to focus on value and also even on cost, we really need to look at what is required to deliver against what we promise to people on the outside. So processes are there. I've heard people say, oh, we don't have processes. I say, yes, you do. Everybody has processes. You may not have formalized them. Part of the problem, I think, is sometimes people think when you say process, you mean procedure. You get down to the every little operating instruction, and people don't want to be proceduralized. But if you think about value streams and processes as a higher level idea, so for example, win new customer is a great process. It doesn't tell me how I do it. It just says I have to get it done. So it keeps the outcomes connected to the strategy, and it delivers the results to the outside world. So, and also, by the way, processes are very straightforward things to measure. How long did it take? How much did it cost? How satisfied are people with the results? So sometimes people deal with all the process things, but they don't call it that. They call it something else. I think process is a really, really good organizer of all these other things we have to do, in my opinion.
Good. You see a difference in these transformational projects between the public and the private sector?
Well, in the private sector, it's easier because because you can focus on specific customers and whether or not you're getting a return on your investment with regard to when you build out capability. It's easier to see it. It's easier to see profit. It's easier to see revenue. It's easier to see how many customers you lost last month and so on. So the measurement piece is the hard part. But in terms of the actual work to be done, public sector has some of the most interesting challenges. And as I showed with the Transit Corporation, for the public sector to work, the challenge is often that you have to combine multiple government departments to get the process to be working right and to get real value. And that's the hard part. I can do a great job of making my department better, but if I'm only part of the solution, it's going to be hard to get that done. So the method, you still have to figure out the right way. The hard part is to find the measures where you can get everybody aligned on the measurement.
Good. You've got your first meeting with an executive or a VP.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you focus and why? You have got an hour with the person, and it's the first meeting you have, and you know he wants to transform his business.
Right.
Where do you focus with that person?
Where I'm going to focus on two main things. I'm going to focus on performance. In other words, performance, which will evaluate how well we're meeting our goals. So first of all, what are the goals? Which is the North Star? What performance do we need in order to achieve it? And also I'm going to focus on risk. In other words, what are the factors that might prevent you from achieving your goals? So if performance is how do I measure against my goals? Risk is what could happen and what indicators can I find to see whether or not you're going to be prevented from doing that. And then I'm going to very much focus on the prioritization that's required to do that. The idea that you cannot boil the ocean. And so with a good transformation-based approach, you can have a very, very good idea of what's necessary first, then second, then third, then fourth, and how you can actually roll it out. Some assurance that we know the whole big thing is risky, but it's risky if we don't take a bit more of a formalized approach that everybody can work towards together. And therefore, we can allocate our scarce resources, including management time, including executive time. I can allocate those scarce resources in the best way. We won't be wasting our efforts.
Now, I'm going to make the assumption that in order for an organization to successfully transform, they need to build their own transformation capability.
Yes.
Competencies, method,
yeah.
Whichever. What would you say are the most important capability to build first in order to take your transformation off the ground or get it started in the right way with the right capability? What are the key capability you need to address?
Yeah, I think to me is actually to get the transformation plan done. That's one of the most critical things. And if you go back to the hexagon, saying, where is it we're going to have our biggest need for change? What are the critical success factors? And so the example I told you before of the snack food company, when the goal was to double your business in 5 years, and the marketplace is not growing much, it became very, very clear that the critical success factor was to acquire capacity from other organizations. And so what they did is they bought a major international company to basically bring up their market share according to the numbers. So what became clear right at the beginning was that we had to figure out where were the strategic priorities within the transformation program. Where is it worth spending our money now versus later? And also for that same company, as I said before, they were basically going from an old version of SAP and going onto a global instance that had 80 other countries on going onto the same instance of SAP, one single global instance. Well, until they had done their process work, they could not define their IT requirements. The temptation would have been, I've got this major IT problem, let's go work at that right now, I figure out the IT. But without knowing what was important in terms of success, without knowing how the work needed to be done, then the IT would have become a risk because we started it too soon. They started it a bit later and it worked. They used the process and the organizational models. They used that to figure out what SAP needed to do, and therefore exactly what the changes were, and get everybody on board with regard to that. So when they rolled it out, everybody who had been impacted by that had already been working on it, so they knew what was coming. So that engagement, but it starts with having a good structure. It also, another critical one in there is a certain degree, and we've seen this echoed by successful companies, a certain degree of patience, managerial patience. We cannot solve every piece of this all at the same time, but we should be doing the right things in the right order. So good program management and knowing where everybody fits, and a lot of it is just good old-fashioned change management, right? So
there are two questions around, is there such thing as a tipping point, or can we predict failure? What are your thoughts around tipping points, make or break transformation and failure? Can you predict failure?
Yeah, I can certainly talk about failure. It's easier to talk about failure, I guess. But failure to me is when these programs are broken into pieces, given to different executives, and each one of them is measured on something different than the others. Because then everybody drives towards, for example, I can get that new piece of IT installed, up and running in a year. But if we haven't even figured out what we want as a business yet, if we're looking at different products, different services, if I'm going to go to market digitally, I need to understand how my stakeholders are going to interact with us in a digital world, which is different operating model than what we're dealing with today. But the technology is installed, so I'm the IT guy, so I have been successful. But my customer experience people, they're working in parallel, but they're driving towards completely different things. This conflict of goals between executives, to me, is the #1 issue why these things fall apart. Because everybody can meet their goal, but overall, it doesn't make the difference. We need to have this integrity across the pieces, the ability to sort of manage this as a integrated program when we're all on the same page with regard to being rewarded for success, not my success or your success or somebody else's success. It sounds crazy, but this happens a lot.
So that is the factor #1 in making or breaking a transformation.
In my experience, yes. Now, usually you figure that out after you've had a failure. You come back and say, well, what was the problem here? And you find that everybody thinks they're successful because they all met their individual goals. But the individual goals are not aligned with the goals of outcome for the business, and quite often are not lined up well with the strategy. That strategic execution doesn't happen because quite often our strategy doesn't talk about departments, but we manage our program by department.
Is there such thing as a tipping point in a transformation change, or if it's like illogical to think in a tipping point?
Well, I think I've seen tipping points which you get to the point you say, this is never going to work, right? We all know never going to work, and yet we're all kidding ourselves and we keep going forward without sort of reformulating the program. That's easier to see. And even the executives will recognize that, but that doesn't mean they'll stop doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And some people have said, for example, the more money you spent already, the more likely you are to stay on the same path, even if you know it's wrong, because you don't want to admit failure. But tipping point for success, I think there's a number of places along the way where executives understand what's happening, and they're prepared to be flexible, and they're involved. It's not like if I see the executives involved and I see people working as a team at the executive level, then I'm much more confident it's going to work. But sometimes I've also seen situations where that was looking very, very good, and a new executive, new CEO would come in and say, "What are you guys doing?" And then change everything, and then all of a sudden it goes from a positive. So it wasn't really a tipping point, but it was a good. We were on the right path if we kept on going on that path. But I think it's easy to see risks early.
Yeah. Est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui ont des questions pour Roger? Je pense que vous êtes tous, vos micros sont ouverts. Donc, deuxième tour. Avez-vous des questions pour Roger? OK, donc j'entends pas de questions. Roger, il nous reste, we have about 3 minutes left.
Time for one more.
What would you recommend to business consultants, strategists, manager? What advice would you give them to increase their influence at the strategic level and play a key role in these transformational playbook? What would be your advices?
So, Gilles, you mean like how can we make a difference to the executive?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I think that one thing we can do is be trusted advisor. So to be almost like your co-pilot type of approach. So and to keep advising that one thing is not going to solve your problem. Saying, okay, we need focusing on a capability, getting all of our capabilities figured out. It looks attractive, but I build all those capabilities and they end up with 1,000 microservices, and none of them work together because I don't know how the business is going to run. And I think it's just really keeping people focused on the business. And I mean, the processes are important, the data is important, the capabilities are important. Those are all the things I build with. But what am I building is really the question. So just keeping people focused, as opposed to getting caught up in day-to-day technical problems. Keeping your eye on where we're going, and when I mentioned before the North Star, every meeting you ever go into, bring the North Star and say, remember, this is what we're trying to do. Is the choice you want to make right now? Which is the best one to meet the North Star? Never take your eye off the goal. And you know, that means you have to be prepared to change course sometimes.
Good. Well, Roger, thank you very, very much for the time you spent with us. I do hope that the audience did appreciate the first webinar and the insights into process-driven transformation. Certainly, they could see that it's not an exact science, but nor it is an art, and it needs a framework that allow us to have freedom. And I think that's what you have shown us. So a big thank you again, Roger. Everyone, hope you have enjoyed it and you found it useful.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
And we'll see you next webinar.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks a lot, Roger.
Okay.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for the presentation.